I was 21 when I first met Darcy. It was cold, the snow lining the roads no longer white but muddy brown, and the street was dark. I was walking quickly, eager to return to my apartment when a sudden light caught my eyes. It was a small shop, tucked away between the larger buildings along the pavement, but the light from inside seemed to spill out, ghostly yellow fingers reaching through the display windows and onto the street. My feet stopped on their own. I had to look. There were dolls in the windows, Victorian with frilly dresses and shiny hair. They were all smiling. I remember thinking that was strange. I'd never seen Victorian dolls with smiling mouths. Dolls, in my experience, were melancholy creatures, frozen girls with pouty lips and empty eyes. But these dolls were different. It wasn't just their smiles, it was their soulful eyes, their soft expressions, the warmth in their faces. These dolls had stories, I thought. They had lives. I still longed for the comfort of my warm apartment after a tiring day, but it occurred to me that one of these dolls would be perfect for my sister, 9 years old at the time. Her birthday was approaching, and she'd always wanted a doll with a pretty dress. So I went inside. From the moment I entered the shop, I could feel the energy. The shelves were filled with empty dolls, paralyzed and perfect, yet I never felt so surrounded by life, by the existence of it. There was a counter further inside, covered in papers and fabrics, and a sewing machine on one end. A girl was bent over it, slender fingers the color of porcelain barely moving as the paintbrush they held inched towards the doll resting atop the pile of fabric. The girl's hair was short, falling in a dark auburn bob just above her shoulders. Choppy bangs obscured her right eye. Her left was almond brown and narrowed in concentration. She didn't seem to notice me. There was no bell over the door, and violin music was playing loudly, masking the sound of my footsteps. I stood in silence, awkward but not wanting to startle her, until she suddenly looked up. Her eyes widened. I noticed a smattering of freckles across her nose and thought that she looked terribly young for someone so skilled. She couldn't have been older than I was. She smiled then, after turning the music down, and for a moment I wondered if she too wasn't just another doll. She introduced herself as Darcy. I couldn't tell if that was her first name or her last, and from her grin I suspected that she intended that. She wanted to know what sort of doll I was looking for, so I told her about my sister, and the grin faded, replaced by the slightest frown as she listened carefully. After sitting in silence for a minute, she stood up, and again I was struck by the thought that she looked less real than her dolls. Small and pale, and dressed in a black corset and skirt and fingerless gloves. She could have stepped out of the pages of a Gothic fairy tale. She was looking thoughtfully at me when she said she knew just the one. The doll wasn't quite complete. There were still a few finishing touches she wanted to add, but she was positive that this doll would fit my sister perfectly. She brought it down from a shelf and held it out to me, looking for all the world like a proud mother. I remember feeling impressed. The doll had green eyes and dark hair and a soft gray dress, just to my sister's tastes. She grinned when I told her, but when I glanced at the tag and went to pay, she stopped me. There was just one more thing left, she explained, and walked into a small room within the shop. I don't know why I followed her in. Maybe if I hadn't, I would have bought the doll and left, and never seen her again. Maybe if I hadn't, both of our lives would have turned out quite differently. But I did. There were only shelves inside this room, filled with empty jars, each labeled with a name and a date. I was confused. Preparing to ask what it was, I moved towards her, and our hands brushed for the slightest moment. In that moment I saw it. Inside every jar was a tiny sphere of light, pale blue and soft. I stepped back, breaking the contact, and the lights disappeared. My shock must have shown because she looked at me strangely, and then slowly, tentatively, stretched out her hand and took a hold of mine again. I had almost expected it, but nonetheless I was surprised to see the lights return. When I turned around, Darcy was staring at me with wide eyes. "You can see them," she whispered, barely audible in the silence. "What are they?" I asked her in answer. Her eyes gleamed, her whole face lit up with the smile that broke out across it. "Souls," she said. "They are the souls of people who died suddenly, before their time." Softly, she explained, "They weren't prepared for death, so their souls got lost on the way there." She told me she didn't know where there was exactly, only that some souls found their way to it and some didn't. It was these souls that gave her dolls that strange sense of life. "When I touch them," she explained, "I can see them. Who they were, how they died, what sort of home they should have. And I put them in my dolls and give them the warmth they need." She grew more excited with every word, and soon she was pulling me all around the space, introducing me to every little sphere in every little jar in the room. "No one's ever been able to see them," she confessed, gripping my hand tighter. "I thought I was the only one." I asked her, as we left the room with the jar labeled Jasmine 211216, how she could have such a wide assortment of souls when all her dolls were female. She drummed her fingers on the counter for a long time before replying. "The souls don't have genders or identities," was her answer. "They just are." Her smile was sweet and sad at once. "They're not conscious, but they can feel. Most of them feel confused and scared, but when they're inside one of the dolls with a loving family, they're not scared anymore. They're happy. I can tell." I watched her lift the jar to the doll's mouth, watched Jasmine's soul float up and diffuse through the porcelain, watched the glossy eyes come to life. I paid for my sister's gift and thanked her, and before I was 2 steps out of the door I knew I would be back. And I was, of course I was. Barely a week after that visit, I was stepping into her shop again, greeted by her smile and a new doll, a new life to meet. She told me about the first time she saw one, a snowy morning when she was 7, a glowing ball hovering just above the icy lake near her house. I left with that buzz of life still thrumming within me, and 2 days later I was back, with snacks to share. Before the month was out, I'd made it part of my daily routine to drop by Darcy's shop every evening. On these visits, she would turn down the music, violin, always violin, and tell me stories. She told me about her family, her mother, a baker, and her 2 older brothers, twins now teaching at their old school. She told me about her favorite foods, her taste in movies, the countries she wanted to visit. I, in turn, told her about my bookstore, about the stories I wrote in my spare time, about the friends I'd had in school, and the numerous times my parents had lost me at nature parks. She listened so sincerely when I spoke, laughed genuinely at my anecdotes, answered my questions with pure honesty. She even read my stories, and smiled like sunlight every time I brought her a new chapter. Once I tried to give her a gift, a black satin ribbon to hold back the bangs that fell over her right eye. I thought she would find it useful. She laughed at me when I presented it to her, laughed and then tied it around her neck instead. That day she pulled me behind the counter and sat me down with the brushes and paints and fabrics. She showed me how she made her dolls, guided my hands, taught me the techniques that lay behind their gentle faces. Every evening without fail, she would be working when I arrived. Before we spoke of anything else, she would introduce me to the doll, to its name, its life, its death. I came to know every doll in that little shop, and every doll she would go on to make. I think I was as much in love with Darcy's shop as I was with her. And I did love her. I don't know when it happened exactly. I don't know when talking with her became the highlight of my days, don't know when I started wanting to take her hand, not to see the souls, but just to feel her fingers intertwined with my own. I don't know when she started to feel the same, but I fell in love with Darcy to the soft crescendo of violins. That I know, and that I'll never forget. I saw a soul once without touching her. It was a cold winter night, not as cold a winter as when we'd first met 2 years before, but cold enough to have us clinging to each other for warmth on the icy streets. We were almost to my apartment, but it was late. She'd had a difficult time with a new doll's dress and hadn't wanted to leave the shop until it was perfect. She was always a perfectionist. It was snowing and the street lamps were flickering. I remember these details, oddly enough. I'd been saving for a better apartment on a better street, an apartment for two. But at the time, I only had my small one-room lodging on a small road with street lamps that flickered, and it was cold. I don't know whether they were drunk or driving too fast or both. I don't know if they swerved or if they lost control of the car and skidded on the ice. I don't know, I never asked, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was lying on her back on the road and her favorite dress was getting dirty from the tainted snow. My first thought was that she would be furious. It had been her mother's dress once, and I'd seen her go to great lengths to avoid any harm to it. And now it was soaking up muddy ice on a dirty road. For the longest moment, that was the only worry in my mind, the only thought. And then there it was, a ball of blue light hovering above her lips. I was stumbling forward before my mind could catch up, and gently I let the sphere float into my hand. I saw her, standing in front of me with that sweet and sad smile. And then she was gone. I put the soul in a jar when at last I returned to my apartment. It faded from my vision the moment the lid was on. I haven't seen another one since. A week later, a man in a suit came by with a package and a letter. She'd left me a doll. A doll with auburn hair and brown eyes and black clothes like the art of a Gothic fairy tale. For a moment I was confused. This doll's face was clear, unmarked. Then I saw the note. You complete me in raw, messy script that had always seemed so inconsistent with her delicate image. I took the doll to the shop, picked out a brush, began painting on the freckles. I knew how many there were and where, of course I knew. I'd spent so many mornings counting them like some people count the stars, mapping them in my mind, making up constellations to point out to her when she woke. I knew Darcy's freckles better than I knew my own hands. Painting them, however, was to be a challenge. It was as if, should I miss a single spot or paint just one dot out of place, she wouldn't be right. She wouldn't be my Darcy. A foolish worry, I know. That doll wasn't Darcy. Neither was the soul inside it any more her. It was just a sphere of energy, as she said. Just potential. Yet once that little sphere was inside the doll, I could swear its eyes lit up, almost exactly like hers. I had dolls made for the remaining souls. Although I could no longer see them, I knew them all by heart, and I could tell by the way the doll's eyes shone that the souls had found their way in. Her mother joined me and her brothers, and together we worked to provide every lost soul in the shop with a warm home. And when they were gone, the shop that had once drawn me in for its light and its warmth became cold and empty. It broke my heart. But, as it happens, Darcy had planned for that too. For a girl so full of life, it still surprises me how well prepared she was for death. Darcy loved her shop, and she would never entrust it to a stranger. So she left it to me, left me to decide what to do with it. I took the shop without hesitation. Though small, it was bigger than my bookstore, and more importantly, it was hers. I moved my books into the shop and dedicated the extra space to a carpeted corner filled with beanbags and fairy tales, for the children so often dragged along while their parents browsed my more antique collection. I placed the last remaining doll in the corner, on a grey beanbag that matched well with her Gothic clothes. She's popular amongst them, the children. Every time I look over, I can see them patting her hair and admiring her dress. Children always loved Darcy. And I swear, it's unbelievable at best, but I swear, when they sit around her and the corner fills with the sound of childish laughter, her smile widens and her eyes shine just a little more. It seems impossible, I know, but that's okay. Impossible or not, it's okay because she's happy. I can tell. Hey, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story, and if you did, maybe leave a comment. That's how I know to make more. And I have a lot more. I have a shitload of stories, some of them quite similar to this one, some of them very different, most of them centered around the theme of urban fantasy, and all of them collecting dust in the darkest recesses of my laptop. I would really like for them to see the light of day at least once, so if you'd like that as well, please let me know by commenting and or subscribing. Otherwise, yeah, thank you for watching and enjoy the rest of your descent into the YouTube rabbit hole. Bye!